Yes. So welcome to this event tonight, which is a town hall meeting on COP26 and what the JCU delegation that went to COP26 learned and all that they would like to share with you. I was their chaperone, so to speak. This group of students didn't need a chaperone at all. They were very well organized on their own, but I was very happy and very privileged when I was asked to go along with them. I learned a lot, and I know that they learned a lot. COP26 will probably be remembered as a historic moment in our times. And one of the reasons that COP26 will be an important moment in history is that the youth has taken a very important role in climate discussions. And they are starting now to hold governments and diplomats and companies and executives accountable for their pledges. So I think that on the one hand, John Cabot is very lucky to have such an engaged group of students because these are the leaders of tomorrow. I also think that we should thank John Cabot University, the president, student services, vice president, Jose Alvarez, the Institute for Entrepreneurship, for all of the support they have given us for making this trip possible and making possible this giving back to the community. This is what the town hall is about. So what I would like tonight is for the students who participated to share with you what a fantastic experience it was. And I know that they're even going to be using some of the venue settings, some of the sounds, some of the colors that made this absolutely extraordinary. There's some of the venues we were in replicated a forest, replicated of savanna with the smell and the sounds of the birds. So it was just extraordinary. But also, I hope that they will elicit on your part questions, a debate, or even just question marks about what our role is in making sure that climate change doesn't turn into a climate disaster for all of us. So now it's my pleasure to give the word on to President Pavoncello, who would like to introduce, and then again, we will start with the student delegates. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much, Michelle. And thank you for organizing this trip, and thank you all for going. I'm sure we were very well represented at the meeting. And I think this was a very important meeting. H.G. Wells said that civilization is a race between education and catastrophe. And in a way, the environmental crisis we are facing seems to be very much in line with this race between education and catastrophe. It is a crisis which has been brewing, and it has now assumed important dimensions, which calls for immediate answers, which is really what the United Nations, the NGOs, the youth of the world are asking for. But I think that, however, the COP26 should be looked at in a chiaroscuro type of light, in the sense that it was very important and encouraging because it brought once again on the table the issue of climate change and what to do to fight it. At the same time, what we have seen with COP26 is how difficult it is for countries, for governments, to face the kind of measures that are required to reach the goals that were established in Paris. And I think that this is a tension. This is the main tension that we have here. Because basically, at the end of the day, we see countries like India or China basically toning down some aspects of these commitments. At the very last moment, there was we moved from phase out to phase down. And basically the kind of reduction that stemmed out from the Paris, from the Glasgow meeting is only 0.03 degrees Celsius. So what remains to be done to close the gap is between 17 billion and 20 billion tons of CO2, which is in terms of the timing, which is 2030 and 2050, moving back to a 1.5 Celsius before civilization, really presents enormous difficulties for countries and government to reach that goal. And I think that what we have to see is what is going to be the future of this commitment. Now we're not going to have any more a 5-year get together. Now every year, everybody's going to be required to express what they want to do. And I think that this is important because although the sense is that with the present situation, not only we're not going to cut down CO2, but actually CO2 will be growing by the mid-century. What we have to understand and explore is also what will human ingenuity do in the future to mitigate, to accommodate, and to reduce with new technologies, with new inventions. And you know, we live in a world of singularity, so that intellectual capacity grows constantly, exponentially, day after day. So I think we should also keep a bit of faith in human ingenuity in preventing catastrophe, because mankind has adapted through time. But certainly, what remains to be seen is this capacity of the world, of nations of the world, to really confront with this very ambitious goal of cutting. Basically, what is required is a 45% cut of emissions from the 2010 levels. And you know, I was looking at the import of coal from the United States by Germany. Between 2020 and 2021, import of coal by Germany from the United States has grown 300%. So I think it's also important to understand the disconnect that exists between where the world necessity and needs and economic necessities taking the world and what we hope to achieve. Because that is an important aspect that we have to keep in mind, because if we move away from realism, we're going to weaken the attempt to reduce this potential crisis that is coming our way, but which, if we don't do something, quite probably will come our way. So I think that the work that you've done going there, and I know that the kind of work that you've been doing and with grassroots has been doing is so important. I think this is really commendable. I hope that in the future, John Cabot will take also other initiatives, which we are exploring to give a, you know, to give a sign, to give a to make a statement about our commitment to the fighting the climate crisis. And I want to thank you all, and I want to wish you all the best for this talk. and for the rest of your activity. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So, good evening, everybody. I am Giacomo Di Capo. I am the current president of the Grassroots Environmental Club. And today I've been tasked with the daunting challenge of trying to introduce COP26. What is COP26? Why 26? So I have compiled a little journey for us to take today and see the historical foundations of what happened in Glasgow 2 weeks ago. And our story starts over 40 years ago. We are in the late 1980s, 1988 to be precise. And international environmental law had been growing and had been becoming stronger, but as of 1988, there was no single mention of climate change. No single mention of climate change. But something drastically changed in the summer of 1988. And it is the 27th of June, 1988, when the General Assembly of the United Nations passes the first resolution on specifically on global warming, saying that it's a common concern for mankind. So we transitioned from not having no mention at all to being a common concern for mankind. And in the span of 2 years, a summit of head of states, a ministerial briefing, the second World Climate Conference, all happen, all take place, all diverging and directing political attention to one single, very complex issue, global warming. And although many coalitions start to emerge on how to regulate, what to regulate, and how to move forward to tackle this enormous challenge, for the first time, we can see that there is growing international political momentum to take on climate change. And even at the United Nations level, we start to see talks on building an international system of governance to take on this massive planetary challenge. The General Assembly even tasked a negotiating committee to come up with a framework convention. Here are the key words: framework convention, with what they called appropriate commitments. This momentum leads to this year, 1991, one of the most important dates for international climate law, May the 9th. On this date, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is adopted. This convention, often referred to as FCCC, establishes three basic dynamics that will remain prevalent and dominant up until Glasgow. The first is the divide between developed and developing countries. Developed countries, often generalized as the global north, are required to take the lead on climate action, because historically they're seen as the responsibles for the majority of greenhouse gas emissions. The second is the divide among developing countries themselves. Within the developed countries that we'll refer to as Annex 1 countries, as opposed to developing countries that very intuitively are called non-Annex 1 countries, there's a third group, Annex 2 countries. There are the wealthy of the wealthy. And this second division is fundamental because these are the countries that are required also to provide financial and technological assistance. And the third basic dynamics that convention establishes is that a conference of states that become parties, so a conference of states that become parties, be discussing the development and the evolution of the international climate law. This conference of states will be called Conference of Parties, or COP. These three fundamental dynamics will remain all the way across the decades, almost equal. And the Framework Convention is a great first step, but to many is not enough. We move to 1995. This first conference of the parties, COP1, convenes in Berlin to start discussing about more stringent regulations on this harmful greenhouse gases, but also a system to trade special certificates that are granted to states when they decide to invest in a project that reduces emissions. These special certificates will be called emission credits, and emission credits are crucial to understand COP26. We move to 1997. Negotiations from COP21 in Berlin continue for 2 years. They keep talking. 1997, there's a major breakthrough, the Kyoto Protocol. Because of the skepticism of a lot of countries, the Kyoto Protocol, although adopted in 1997, didn't come into force until 2005, after being famously rejected by the United States in 2001. And after 2005, states start wondering about what would happen in 2012. The Kyoto Protocol was an extraordinary piece of international law. It established a system of trading this special certificates, so trading emissions, but it had one major shortcoming. It stopped at 2012. So legislators thought that by 2012, they would have figured it out. There would be a system of governance that would be continuous. But come 2012, still nothing on the table. So they start renegotiating the course of action, what to do after the Kyoto Protocol expires. And there are numerous conferences. There is the Marrakesh conference, the Bali conference, the Copenhagen conference, COP16, COP17, COP18, until we arrive to what is considered to be the legal heir to the Kyoto Protocol. We are now in 2015, year in which on December 12th, the 196 countries that participate in COP21 in Paris signed the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement will go down in history as one of the, probably the landmark piece of international climate negotiations. And in particular, the agreement brings the attention and discussion on climate action forward on four major counts. First, it identifies that countries cannot only reduce emissions, but they must also increase the level of renewables, so alternative sources of energy. Otherwise, climate action would not be sustainable. The second, it includes an aspirational objective. This is what was missing in Kyoto. States did not know where they were going. Instead, in the Paris Agreement, there is a clear objective: keep global warming to maximum 1.5 degrees Celsius. The third count is establishing clear deadlines. The Paris Agreement asks countries to reconvene every 5 years and resubmit their own plan to achieve a planet no warmer than 1.5 degrees Celsius. And last, it defines a budget. For the first time, it mandates that developed countries, those Annex 1 countries that we've seen before, must spend $100 billion a year in helping developing countries with climate adaptation, so coping with the consequences of climate change. It was a top-down agreement because the goal was the same for every single one state, maintaining 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming. But it was also top-down because countries could decide how to get there. They could reflect and see what were their capabilities and strengths. So despite having been called the Treaty of the Century, the Paris Agreement still lacks some fundamental mechanisms to make it operational, including how to provide this $100 billion to developing countries. Which brings us to November 2020, when the COP26 was scheduled to take place in Glasgow, the capital of Scotland. But COVID pandemic hits and the conference on which so many hopes were resting is canceled and is postponed to 2021. Finally, on October 31st, 2021, the 26th Conference of the Parties opens. Representatives from 190 countries fly to Glasgow to deliver on very high hopes. And there were three main expectations, and remember this as we walk through the main themes. Three main expectations. The first one is states are expected to decide how public finance will deliver this $100 billion to developing countries. The second is that after the 2020 cycle of nationally determined contributions, there is just a fancy name for the plans that each state made to reach a world of 1.5 global warming need to be more ambitious, need to be updated. And the last one is that the very successful negotiations that happened in Paris concerning adaptation to climate change need to be operationalized. So there need to be technical systems so that the Paris rulebook, so-called Paris rulebook, a set of rules with which states decide how to tackle climate change, is made concrete, real. We arrived here, November 4th, 2021. The JCU delegation arrives in Glasgow, and the outcome of the conference as we arrive is still uncertain. Negotiations are underway. Today, we will share some insights on key themes that emerged in the Glasgow conference and then featured in the Glasgow Climate Pact. There was the final agreement that was published on November 12, 2021. So our goal is to share the privilege of being there. It was an amazing experience. And the second goal of today's event is to let you decide whether COP was a failure or a success. So it is with great pleasure that I introduce the first three panelists that will discuss around the topic of climate justice.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Alice, and I'm the event coordinator of Grassroots and a staff writer for the Matthew. Today, I want to tell you something about youth involvement in Glasgow, because when we hear about youth involvement, generally, it's easy to picture youth activists marching in the streets, but we may forget in which other ways young activists are involved. For example, in COP26, we had the occasion of listening to some young activists in the panels we attended. One of these panels was the screening of a documentary called Youth Unstoppable, followed by the interview with the filmmaker, later Jewel Kemker, who is a young activist and also the protagonist of this documentary. The documentary was very peculiar because Slater had the chance of participating in COPs since she was 13 years old. So the documentary was filmed over 12 years. And we had the occasion of seeing the evolvement of the youth climate movement through all these years from 2008 until last year. And something that emerged is that besides the evolution of this movement, many things remained the same in the sense that several of the statements and demands of young activists were the same back then as they are today. At the beginning of the movie, there was the declaration of a 13-year-old activist at the UN Climate Summit in Rio in 1992. And I was surprised of hearing how much her words sounded familiar to the ones of today's activists like Greta Thunberg. I think this repetition is due to the fact that global leaders for a long time didn't listen to young activists. In fact, only in COP15, youth activists were recognized as an official constituency at UN climate conferences. The other significant feature of the youth global movement that emerged in Glasgow was that finally diverse voices could emerge from the movement. In one of the panels we attended, there were young Indigenous activists sharing their stories and their experience with the climate crisis. And it was extremely valuable to hear different perspectives from the ones we are used to. Something even later, the filmmaker of the movie said is that young people not only want to sit at the table, they want to change the table. We have Indigenous voices, we have Global South voices, and it's essential to listen to them always, not just at UN conferences or COPs. And this is emblematic of the youth climate movement and how it has become more inclusive and more aware throughout the years of the importance of including all these different voices. And it's important to remind this because global leaders too often pretend to be listening to Indigenous voices, but then there is still a substantial lack of commitments. And a last feature I wanted to share about the youth movement is how coexist very contrasting feelings inside this movement, because Something even later mentioned was that on the one hand, there is hope and optimism, but there are also moments of great despair and discouragement because we don't see significant progress. And I think this was also reflected in our personal experience in Glasgow, because after some panels, we felt slightly disappointed because we were expecting concrete proposals and solutions, but there were just a lot of empty words. On the other hand, however, being part of the environment of COP26 and of a community of people who share the same interests and the same purpose is something extremely empowering, and we could really feel the energy of the youth climate movement while we were there. So that's why I think these kinds of experience are crucial, as we can feel empowered and be led to action instead of feeling stopped and not knowing what to do. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Julissa Castro. I'm the head of editors for the JCU newspaper, The Matthew. And during our time at COP26, we had the opportunity to attend various panels featuring Indigenous activists. And this COP26 Indigenous activists were denouncing the constant neglect their communities were facing and the lack of attention policymakers and countries have towards their issues. The Indigenous communities are facing an upsurge in land grabs, water shortages, and human rights violation, with at least 1,005 environmental and land defenders being murdered since the Paris Accord were signed 6 years ago. So we attended this panel at the New York Times Climate Hub titled Indigenous Rights, Securing the Future of Biodiversity. And we heard from young female activists from around the world as they share how climate change impact their specific communities, their respective communities. Hindu Umar Ibrahim from a Moboro community in Chad share how her people are nomadic. They live of the land and they are able to see how climate change impacts it. She explained how at the international level, they're taking decisions without knowing what's happening on the ground and how it's impacting the communities. So she's trying to create a bridge between those two sides, which it was a sentiment, a goal shared by the other panelists, Cassidy Kramer, who was raised 30 miles above the Arctic Circle as part of the Inuit people. She recalls how her hunters and elders of her community have a generational connection with the land and are able to see these changes on a daily basis. She's using her voice to bring awareness to all of these issues and also make sure her people are part of the decision-making table. Indigenous people are not victims. They refuse to be victims and they are the solution. This was a sentiment shared by all of the activists in the panel. Indigenous activists protect more than 80% of the world's biodiversity. They have more than a scientific knowledge. They have a connection with the land at a spiritual level, a spiritual one as well. And during this COP26, it was announced that 1.7 billion was going to be given to Indigenous people and the local communities, and to protect the planet and their communities in the forest. The governments of the UK, US, Germany, Norway, and the Netherlands are leading this funding, but we still remain to see how they will uphold to all of the promises they did. This is the fruit of the constant work of all of these Indigenous activists, as they are starting to be recognized there's this understanding of how the indigenous people are the real activists. Women in the communities, in these indigenous communities, play a crucial role. While men gravitate toward more labor intense work, women are the ones in charge of the household. They know the land as the palm of their hand. They know which herbs to use for medicine, which to use for food. They know by looking at the sky, how's the weather gonna be for the day. So they have all of this knowledge that, you know, like men who work on the more labor will ignore. And more than that, they are the ones educating the youth. Without them, history wouldn't be written because they're the ones advocating for education. They play a detrimental role in the adaptation and resilience of their communities. On the World Climate Summit, we attended a workshop on how can gender equality in education possibly impact climate change. There's substantial evidence pointing to strong correlations between gender equality and in education and better environmental outcomes. Girls in developing countries are more likely to have their education interrupted, becoming child brides at a young age. This was a major issues highlighted in the panel, and they were discussing how can we make sure girls all around the world have at least 12 years of interrupted education, as this leads to their empowerment. They were mentioning the importance of building their green skills, building a voice and pathway for girls' leadership, that they can acquire, 21st century skills so that they can contribute to the green economy. Bringing climate education to everyday life skills has proven to be beneficial. Gender transformative climate activists from all around the world have come together to stress the importance of the issue. There needs to be, not only at a governmental level, but also as an institutional level, a curriculum reform to recognize the problems that exist within the education system so that we can address each of the specifics in it. The panelists were presenting various organizations that focus on providing a girls' education at a secondary and primary level. Representatives from the Malala Fund, Girls Rising, and the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institute were all present to stress the importance of the matter. So overall, this experience has been more than eye-opening, but we saw this constant stress of women involvement, Indigenous rights, and how both of these communities and this specific have been neglected. So we still, after the conclusions of it, we still need to see how all of the work that has been done COP26 is gonna affect them. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I'm Eleonora. I'm the food officer of Grassroots Club and incoming vice president. As you can see from the slide in the background, I would talk about climate justice, which seems like a very far away topic. However, it's much closer than what we think. Well, there was this quote about the role of public international law as being the nervous system of the body of environmental protection. At the roots of what we consider a climate disaster, there are the scientific evidences of the environmental damages that a certain actions has created. Well, this whole discussion about environmental justice was around a topic, like a project created for Brazilian judges so that they can learn in their law schools the basic of science behind climate change. All of this was made so that in courts, they can better evaluate the scientific evidences of environmental disaster. Well, this project shows that today, what we mean by climate justice is not just to look for someone to blame for a problem. It's more of looking for a different pattern of action to fix the problem. In the case of the project, the final goal was to give judges the knowledge, not only to evaluate the scientific evidences of climate disasters, but also to give them the tools to enforce through trials real solution, useful punishment that can really fix climate environmental disasters and fulfill what we call environmental justice. I would like to open the floor for questions, and with a question that was asked to us and to which I couldn't give an answer. So I forward this to you. If we look at past times, we see that science has been welcomed by justice. For example, like if we consider blood sample tests, they have been revolutionary in the field of criminology, to the point that today they are used as evidence, as important evidences, even if judges in the court do not know the chemicals process behind them. They trust science, and that's why we need science, actually. Well, the question is like, why today is so difficult to accept the scientific evidences of climate change in the field of justice? Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. So we'll proceed with Q&A. So we can open the floor for any doubts, reactions, reflections. Present to the panelists.
Also, the offer is given through the chat to the people following from us, following at home.
What was your favorite panel that you attended?
Well, I must say the one on climate justice, that was really eye-opening in the sense that us to witness how climate change can like really go everywhere. And as I said, climate justice is not like something that is done in the courts or like with judges and lawyers. It's something I can start doing from my daily life. Like every day when I choose, like I can choose to take a certain action rather than another, I'm already doing a certain level of climate justice. This is empowering me. And this is like the hope I think Alice was talking about at the beginning. We can and we must do something. And our action starts now, every day, like from the very moment we wake up to the very moment we go to bed.
I think besides the panels, we already talked about one of the most interesting one I followed with Julissa was the one about the decarbonization of cities, because I think that was one of the few panels where the experts present were actually sharing solutions and ways to make their cities carbon neutral and so tackle the climate crisis. And it was also interesting because different perspectives were shared from cities like Berlin and Cambridge to, for example, Bogota. So we really like to see someone giving concrete proposals at this panel.
Well, mine was the Indigenous rights, mostly because of how diverse the panelists were. You did not only have, South America represented, you had countries from Africa. So you had like a more of a global perspective. You had from Alaska, Brazil, Ecuador, and Chad. So they each were sharing their experience, how, their communities have been, managing climate change, how they've been adapting, and what their worries and, are for the future. So I think that it's been, and you have this, all of them, were youth. So you have, besides them being, women, there are also, young people who are using their voice, using their skills, using their platforms to raise awareness and make a change for their communities.
You guys have found that I'm really happy that grassroots and members of the Matthew were able to attend. What you said about how the urgency back then is the same as today, which really resonated, as well as like the importance of how women in Indigenous communities are going to be experiencing the brunt of climate change and how they both are direct multipliers to each other, as well as you and how, Elia, on how each of us can kind of participate in climate justice. My question is particularly, I would love to know if there's anything that you guys gathered in your time at COP26 that you think directly apply to the university, like how us as students and how the university in general, the administration, how we can kind of cooperate to bring solutions at a university level to meet international climate standards.
Yeah. I think especially from what I gather is, education plays an essential role in it. And so, having classes that, that we teach us all of the, basic, but also the nitty and gritty of climate policy making, all of that was going to make a great impact in how we act and how we understand climate change and what we can do about it.
Obviously, I agree with you that education is at the basis, because you really have to understand what we're talking about. We have to be informed. You can't be biased, you can't be prejudiced, you can't just say this is all blah, 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 because that's also not constructive. So if you want to make a difference, you have to be able to understand and then make suggestions or somehow implement a virtuous set of habits in your own lives. I think something else so I totally agree. I also think that universities can, and some universities do, link up. So they create associations of universities that have an even stronger voice. And I think this is something that I think John can do. So to create coalitions, to create groups to collaborate with other universities, and then to make their voice heard. The mere fact that John Cabot has a group like this, that the university sponsored this group to go to COP, that we have this meeting today, is already a sign that John Cabot is kind of ahead of the game, because a lot of universities weren't there, a lot of universities aren't involved. So we can use this momentum to push it forward. And this is something that the university as an institution can do, but also the students themselves and the organizations can help push forward.
Thank you. Jackie, would you like to add anything?
I think that we need to deconstruct a little bit what we mean by climate compliance or climate compliance in general. Because we see the great stages with international players, and we see decarbonization of electricity and green economy, supply chain. But a lot of the bulk, and this is why conferences like COP26 are so crucial, the bulk of climate action lies in everyday operations. So it's not about, of course, it's also about responsible sourcing. So where you take your materials, how you get your materials. But it's also in the very simple things, logistics. How do students go to the university? Is there a system of sustainable mobility? How is there a system of carbon offsetting? Does carbon offsetting work? So it's not about, I think, just ticking off boxes, but just rethinking. There was a very interesting phrase that was mentioned by the head of Net Zero Scotland, the organization that helps businesses become net zero. And he said, we don't need to reinvent products. We just need to reinvent how products are made. And I think this applies a lot also to organizational performance. It's not about reinventing institutions. It's not about rethinking the university, but just how the university takes place. So I think that the definitions can be countless, but it's also about focusing on very simple logistics. That's a great first step to start to see what's the carbon footprint and how to go from there. And this is the work we have been doing with the Climate Panel. So John Cabot is working on this, and actually, if anybody's interested to continue this conversation, there is a technical committee that is aiming to bring John Cabot University to net zero by 2050. And we are talking with Biodiversity and other stakeholders in the university to make this more inclusive and clean. Are there any further questions?
When going to the panels with the different activists, it seems that COP26 is a lot of the proposals are geared towards politicians, leaders of different countries. Do you find that they were gearing their proposals as well, such as college students, and inspiring them to an active role, or possibly millennials, or a more broader audience than, say, someone with a political role?
I can try to answer from my side on like the climate justice, that even if it seems very far away, and the panelists were like lawyers and professors, Oxford professors. So apparently it seems like very far away. We were the audience, we were the targeted audience. So even the very technical ones were made for us to follow. And in the open floor discussion. So I would say for the first panels, that there were both the one we attended at the New York Times Climate Hub and the one at University of Glasgow, all of these panels were made for us. And like, generally speaking, to me, they were successful. Like I had the chance to engage with them, and I participated to the point that I remember what we said.
I think like what we were saying before is that are already a lot involved in the conversation, and what we can look forward is that we will be increasingly listened in the future, because there are significant proposals from youth, and it's not just an empty conversation. Sometimes their words are actually more powerful than the ones of global leaders. So I hope that we will see that more in the future.
For me personally, some of the panels that we attended felt a bit
like, specifying, on certain issue. And some of the panelists were trying to kind of justify their actions, kind of like show a little bit of doing marketing for their companies, instead of going right into the question of the panel, the important issue of the panel. So it really depended on the panels itself. Some of them were like straight to the point, we need to do this, we need to find solutions. Other were like more broad. So yeah, we had a very variety of all of them.
Okay, fantastic. So I think that we can now transition to the second segment. Unfortunately, one of our delegation members is not here, Valentin, but I will try to address very briefly instead the second area of the topics that we've heard. That is more technical. I'm not gonna go into the details, but I think it's a fundamental conversation to have. And the conversation pertains businesses and finance. So how do we think around the new economy of climate? And the second thing is, how do we even conceptualize funding a mass rethinking of society as we know it? The first thing that definitely I have to mention about climate finance at COP26 is that emission trading, so exchanging these certificates that I mentioned before, was fundamental. It was one of the instruments that on which the Paris Agreement relied on to keep global warming to plus 1.5 degrees Celsius. And the establishment of this market for certificates was established because it allows countries to invest in carbon reduction or greenhouse gas reductions where it is most cost efficient to do so. So if in Italy it is too expensive to invest and reduce our own pollution, thanks to these carbon mechanisms, an Italian prime minister could go to another country, purchase something, this green certificate, give them money, and then they can invest in emission reduction projects. However, there are two fundamental problems that remained in Glasgow. The first one was about transparency. There were many concerns that these market mechanisms that to reduce greenhouse gas emissions could incentivize unethical practices. It's a market system after all. And in particular, a lot of experts were concerned that this market mechanism would funnel money into projects that were extremely cheap and very poorly governed. Let's say a forest that maybe is extremely cheap to fund, that on paper shows that you are reducing emissions. But on the other hand, maybe in 2 years from now, it won't exist anymore. So these are not the kind of practices that the Paris Agreement meant to foster. And the second one about accounting, very technical, but one of the very fundamental pillars of this critique of the market system was that reluctant states, experts argue, will find a way to do double accounting. So to invest in one project and claim under different markets for these certificates, because the problem is there are multiple markets. There is the one that was established by the Kyoto Protocol, the one that was established by the Paris Agreement, and there were talks of establishing a new carbon market in Glasgow. Well, the fear is that reluctant states would say, I would spend $1 on carbon emissions, but I will redeem that $1 in all the markets for allowances that exist. And this is double, triple, quadruple accounting. Now, let me share two lessons that we learned from all these very technical panels. The lesson number one is that public finance for climate change is growing, but it's not enough. There was this famous $100 billion pledge from developed to developing countries that was first featured in the Paris Agreement, and that was the major focus for negotiators that flew all the way from the global south and landed in Glasgow. That was their objective, securing the $100 billion. At the General Assembly of the United Nations last October, we saw that American President Joe Biden pledged to triple the American budget for developed countries and move the budget from more or less $8 to $9 billion to $22.8 billion, which is a significant change. There were also other virtuous examples. Probably you've also listened to it themselves. There was the virtuous example of United Kingdom, France, Germany, and the EU helping South Africa move away from coal. So one country aided by other 8 to move away quickly from coal with a package of $8.5 billion. The problem is that those are all promises. That's the fundamental point that the experts stressed. In 2015, the developed countries were promised $100 billion. In 2019, that sum didn't even reach $80 billion. And of those $80 billion, only 1/4, 25% of these funds were committed to adaptation. Adaptation is the life and blood of developing countries in an era of climate change because it allows them to adopt infrastructure, mitigate the effects of sea level rise, heat waves, food security. So the fundamental thing that the Glasgow Climate Pact did was that developed countries pledged to double all the funding that they promised in Paris and to deliver it by 2025, especially for adaptation, passing from $20 billion to $40 billion. Many activists, however, that were in Glasgow claimed that this was only an instance of virtue signaling. Companies were doing it so, or states, governments were doing it just to present a fictitious system of sustainable investing. And we should care deeply about public finance because as we step into the future, we can expect the manifestations of climate change to become more real and closer. We can expect the rising cost of energy, common resources like clean water, the need to adapt to new planetary conditions, including the cost of adapting infrastructure, transportation, energy systems. All these costs will have to be borne by ourselves without a clear international system of public finance. And in order for private and public finance to move simultaneously, experts claim that the latter, so public finance, must display clear long-term vision instead of a hiccup style of commitments, whereby single head of states just claim that they will infuse the market with billions of dollars without ever delivering. The second lesson concerns the question, who should pay for the loss of damage of climate change? We all know that climate change will have a disastrous impact on our societies. And we call loss the permanent losses, and damage instead the repairable damages that are caused by the manifestation of climate change. In 2021, Gabon became the first African country ever to receive funds, to be paid to preserve its own rainforest. It will receive around $150 million in a span of 10 years in investments and result-based payments just to protect its own national rainforest ecosystem. What does this tell us? It tells us that very slowly, we're starting to realize that also the ecosystems have an economic value. This is something that we have known for a long time, but coming on a public realization on a global stage like COP26, it's something radically different. The problem is, how adequate are those instruments? There was an expert at a panel at the New York Times that claimed that the value of the rainforest in Gabon is more or less $200 billion. And the maintenance costed this, they costed us to put forward and to protect this ecosystem was 150 million. How can we expect to protect and do even basic maintenance of an asset worth $200 billion with $150 million? So these financial schemes without a pragmatic solution risk of becoming tree washing, as they defined it at the New York Times Climate Hub, or as the CEO of Edelman Trust, Ed Williams, put it, throwing money at climate change and hoping it sticks. So consensus was that carbon offsets are a partial, if not false, solution. Money cannot put back CO2 into the ground. And this refers to a long-standing debate that was also mentioned before about nature-based solutions versus technological solutions. Should we finance the knowledge that we already know, that we already possess to fight rising greenhouse gas emissions, or should we invest in technological research? And in Glasgow, the attention was focused a lot on nature-based solutions. In 2020, it was estimated that $40 trillion of value generation depended on nature. And this was why the public debate shifted towards more nature-based solutions. And also at the World Climate Summit, there was not anything but a reunion and a summit of investment bankers. It was called the Investment COP. They were starting to say that natural capital is increasingly more deemed to be an asset class, like it is a security. And in finance, we perceive a lot of risk using the metrics of financial assets, how durable they are, how profitable they are, how secure they are. However, in most cases, we fail to understand the ecological risk that makes financial assets possible. So the question that remained open was, do financial risks actually capture ecological risk? If they don't, how can we allocate efficiently funds to protect the climate when we don't have any idea what cost efficiency actually means? And this question extends easily to non-climate finance as well. This is why it's so relevant. As the impact of climate change will become more evident, more far-reaching, how can we determine whether investments carry a certain risk if we cannot embed the ecological risk in them? So Glasgow clearly left the international community with the duty to deal with a more comprehensive system to determine fund allocation in two ways, an unambiguous and comprehensive manner. This, I guess, that concludes the second portion, which is more technical. And I would like to open now to give the floor to Professor Favorite for concluding remarks.
Well, my concluding remarks are going to be very short after all this. I actually was in Rio in 1992 in a delegation representing Eni, the Italian national oil and gas company. And going back to discuss climate in 2021 was exciting. There was definitely a very different atmosphere in Rio in 1992 and in Glasgow in 2021. But one of the biggest changes was, you may not appreciate it so much because you're so young, was that there was definitely no one below the age of 40 or 50. I was an exception. I was very young then. But so the average age of people at Rio, even in the side events, was very, very high. And it was mostly men. So I was one of the youngest women in Rio discussing sustainability. The fact that in Glasgow, you had a seat, you were listening to people your age from all over the world, and people were listening to your questions and answering them, marks a colossal shift, which is very important. The important thing is that people your age be informed. And this is one of the reasons why universities play such an important role in youth activism in climate change. So what I hope is that you will take the privilege that you've had and you will use it to your own empowerment, but also to the empowerment of others. One of the questions that I always get from students in my classes, now mind you, I don't teach sustainability, I teach business communication and public relations. So in theory, I shouldn't be teaching sustainability at all. But since I think this is the #1 issue that young people face on the planet, I weave it in somehow or other, just about in every class. And one of the questions that I always get from students is, but what can we do about it? We feel so helpless. What can we do? And then the other reaction I see also is that the complexity of the theme makes them feel very unempowered and makes them feel paralyzed. So they retreat and they pretend it's not there. So speaking as someone who deals with students your age all the time, I would really encourage you now to take the baton, use it to make people your age, for example, in this community, empowered, help them understand what they can do, break them out of this feeling of paralysis and feeling of eco-anxiety, and make them understand that the more you know, the more you can do, and that there's a lot you can do at your age. So this, although COP didn't end as we would have liked it, it certainly wasn't everything that we would hope that it would be. It didn't deliver on all the promises. Getting together 190 countries and getting them to agree on a lot of very, very crucial pledges is already, I think, phenomenal. Now it's up to us to keep that flame lit. And so I hope that this is it spurs you all to action. It spurs you all to thinking. It spurs you all to understanding better. Thank you.
And before we conclude this wonderful session, since we couldn't determine it ourselves, we just wanted to ask you, from what you heard today, by show of hands, who thinks that COP26 was a success? Who thinks that COP26 was a failure? Okay, let me try again. Middle of the road. Who think it was a moderate success? That's the majority. Okay, so as we conclude, we would like to thank Vice President Alvarez, Vice President Merva, the logistics and support in the entire planning of this delegation trip. Ms. Pilar Murguia for helping us organize the entire travel. Ms. Corinza Batucci and Azelia Terzi for helping us organize instead this town hall, the marketing department for their assistance in media coverage, and web updates department, of course, for being here to cover this, and also, of course, the student leaders that made this possible. So all the activists and members of Grassroots and the Matthew, since they have been the core of this entire project. So thank you very much for being here and have a wonderful rest of your evening.